afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Happy New Year to all of you. I know it's the end of January, but this was the first time
New Year's.
to wish all of you a Happy New Year. And remember, I told you you have to make 2024 your best year ever, okay? That's a promise to yourself, right? And to me. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to get started on, let me see, all the proposed changes for a TREC, okay? And so what we're going to review a little bit before we get started on that, I'm going to talk to you about a little TREC update, and then I'll do a recap of the changes, and then we'll look at the review of the forms itself, okay? So a little update on TREC. Remember, please use only the current forms available to you, and the Consumer Protection Notice was revised and given to us last September. So just make sure they're updated on your websites and stuff like that. On the matter of wholesalers, the law changed. We had a big legislative session last year, and we had lots of changes. But in this one, a wholesaler is not licensed by TREC, right? And they can practice as long as they cannot practice, but they can conduct transactions as long as they disclose both to the buyer and seller their interest in the property and the activity. And that is a law that passed January 1. They have to disclose their interest in the property in writing to buyers and sellers, okay? Now, we don't have any forms that allow wholesaling, okay? And what I have found in all the multitude of situations that we've encountered is that a wholesaler approaches a seller who's in distress, right? And gets under contract. They don't necessarily use the TREC forms. Typically, they're like one-page type contracts. They're very suspect. If you looked at them, you'd think, why would anybody agree to this, right? And then what they do when they've gone under contract with the seller, they find some listing agent that'll put it in MLS so that they can find a buyer. And what happens is our buyer's agents see this listing. They're not thinking that it's not the owner of record, right? They're thinking that it's a true seller. And what is more upsetting is I've seen the document. It's a one-pager. And the seller, the real owner of record, says, oh, I give all my rights to this buyer I have under contract to put it in MLS and negotiate. What seller on this planet would ever give any rights to a buyer under contract? Tell me. What sellers would do that, folks? None.
None.
Absolutely. And it's just a piece of paper and they've signed it. And I'm thinking, I don't care. That doesn't mean that that individual who got that listing agent to put it in MLS and fool buyers thinking that they're the owner of record when they're not, right? I was hoping all of that would end with this new law, but apparently people are still doing crazy things. So just be very guarded about that. As I said, we don't have anything to do with assignments. We have no promulgated forms. That is not what we do. Our buyers would only want to go under contract with whom? The real sellers of the property, right? So it's a very tricky thing. And here's what I'm going to tell you what's interesting. When TREC did their survey a few years ago, and we all were asked all sorts of questions, they interviewed buyers that were actually investors, right? They're a different type of buyer, right? They know more. They're doing it from an economic standpoint. They're doing it from a portfolio maybe that they want to have. And their complaint was to TREC is that it was not clear on the assignment, and we have no assignment forms, but they were saying it was not clear all the fees that they would have to pay when they took over the assignment. So anyway, unfortunately, these are predatory practices and we don't do that. But now they must disclose in writing to a prospective buyer and seller their true interest in the property. And what they're selling, when they go under contract with a seller, what they're selling to another buyer is what? Their equitable interest, their contractual interest in a contract. They haven't closed on it, right? On these type of things. Don't be fooled by title companies saying, don't worry, we know how to close these. The problem would be is if you gave any advice to your buyers and thought everything was okay. That's where you get into trouble on something like that. Any questions about this?
No, it's Marlene.
Okay.
It's only some.
Okay. The other thing I'm going to mention right now, because I'm getting way too many of them, we have sellers that are getting offers from buyers that are, quote, calling it subject to the transaction. Our forms cannot be used for those. Those are not transactions we have any documents for. Subject to means that it's a wraparound. The seller is still obligated to their lien holders and all these different things. And a lot of times we advise our clients, if they get an offer like this and they're considering it, that we recommend they seek an attorney, right? A real estate attorney to give them legal advice, because we are never going to say a wraparound is okay. It is a risk-laden transaction and it's not okay. So, and we've had attorneys who we recommended our clients to, they got sued on it because it didn't handle it well. So we're not talking about something that we're just going to say everything is okay. In that instance, I don't think your sellers have an option to consult a real estate attorney. They will have to, because our forms cannot be used for those types of transactions. And here's what's even crazier. These buyers are submitting a subject to addendum. Well, guess what, folks? TREC says only the owner of the property or the owner's attorney can bring forms into the contract that are not promulgated. So again, that's why your sellers have to be told this is not something that you would ever advise, mainly because of all the risks that are still involved on something like that. And I love the title company saying, oh, don't worry, we know how to handle this. Yeah, they're not going to be sued. They oftentimes say that those types of things. So just be on the alert for that kind of thing, because it's going around everywhere. We're having to untangle so many of them where the sellers already signed the addenda provided by the buyer about the subject to wraparound transaction and all the things that they forego and waived and gave away all their rights. And it's disastrous. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today are the various proposed forms, changes, as well as 2 new forms that they have out there. I've given kind of a little recap, but now I'm going to get to the actual forms itself. Can everybody see the unimproved property contract? Can y'all see that?
Yes.
Yes, Marilyn.
Thank you, because I know what I see, but I don't always have it where you can see it. Okay, so we're going to go through this. If you look up in the upper right-hand corner, that's the date that they were proposing that these contracts would be approved by TREC. TREC has a meeting in our Texas Realtors winter meetings when they're going on the 12th of February. That has all been tabled. And I'm going to go through why they've tabled it when I go through the various changes and stuff like that on that. So the first contract one we're going to look at is the unimproved property contract, right? Now, what they're doing, and you're going to see this, you're going to see a familiar paragraph change that they've inserted in 3D. It is very similar in word for word from the farm and ranch contract. And this is where the parties could agree right now at time of execution of contract if they'll adjust the sales price based upon what the survey comes back with the number of acres. And you have to put in what the original acreage is that they were told, then what the survey, how many dollars per acre, it could be adjusted upward or downward in that type of thing. So they've added a provision in the unimproved property contract that is very similar to the farm and ranch contract. And what's interesting is the farm and ranch contract can really be used for those properties where it is farm and ranch property, right? It's either currently being used as ranch land or it is a farm and that type of thing. What you'll see in every last one of them is in the leases, they've added geothermal because there are parts of Texas that actually have geothermal leases that are on these properties. So they wanted to add that because they wanted to make sure that all of these natural resource leases that they were aware of are incorporated in our contract forms.
Hey, Marilyn, I have a quick question before you go on. It's
Uh-huh.
Carla. So on the unimproved property, can this be used on property that has a mobile home on it?
Is the mobile home permanently attached to the property?
Well, yes. I mean, mobile homes are not an easy thing to move. So to me, they're more permanent than they are mobile, even though they're called mobile. So
there's a differentiation. That's why I asked. If it's permanently attached, meaning it's retrofitted and attached to the real property, it goes on the 1 to 4. If it's going to convey as a non-realty item addendum, it would be on the unimproved property contract.
Okay, so it can be either way. Well, this one is tied down with straps and all, so it was just a question.
1 to 4 family then only.
Okay, even if they tell you in advance that they are planning on moving it, like they have intentions to move it, so they're just selling the raw land?
Well, no, that would be different, and the buyers and sellers would have to probably negotiate something in special provisions regarding the removal of it.
Okay, thanks.
And the restoring of the property in good condition after the removal.
Okay.
Something like that probably is what a buyer would want.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. The next change that we're going to see is in paragraph 6C, you know, my favorite one, survey, right? So let me just give you a little update on this. This is the reason they are tabling these changes to our contract forms until later in the probably midsummer, like July or so. And the reason for that is 6C1, everybody knows how I feel about that, right? And I'm going to tell you what really upset me a little bit, because I listened to the Broker Lawyer Committee's meeting for over 6 hours. That was torturous in itself. But one of the lawyers on the Broker Lawyer Committee actually represents title companies, right? And he laughed about a survey company coming after a brokerage or an agent. And one of the other brokers on the committee said, we have 3 right now. We have 2 in Bastrop where surveys come after us, and in Austin. And you know what? Title companies don't care. Lenders don't care. If you infringe copyright, your sellers are going to blame you. And the reason they're saying there's no big lawsuit out there, because the agents realize they have no insurance coverage for copyright protection. They have to settle it. They have to go to a bank and get the money to settle the demand. So I thought it was highly disrespectful. Texas Realtors was dead on. When we met, we removed it from the seller's disclosure that the survey was even attached because of the copyright issues. So I'm just telling you this because you don't participate in any infringement of copyright, period. You don't help your sellers infringe upon it, period. And 6C1 talks about the seller has to give you an existing survey and the notarized attached T47, right? That's those 2 elements that have to be satisfied within those number of days. Otherwise, the seller has to buy you a new one 3 days prior to closing. Okay. Well, the title associations have approached the powers that be to get approval for what they call a declaration. See, the T47 affidavit has to be notarized. And even the attorney who was spouting off about he didn't believe a surveyor would come after all these brokers and listing agents like they have, he said, if it's not notarized, the seller will have to buy a new one. He said, the title companies that say we'll notarize at closing, he said, don't do your seller any favors and hurt the buyers, because the provision is very clear in there. If the seller fails to furnish the existing survey or the affidavit within the time prescribed, buyer shall obtain a new survey at seller's expense, no later than 3 days prior to closing date. Here's the deal. This declaration they're creating would be a a form the sellers could use in lieu of the affidavit. And we can't change the contract forms now because it hasn't been finally approved through the Texas Department of Insurance and other powers that be that will have to approve it. They're thinking it should come late May, June, the approval. Then they can modify the contract forms to include a declaration or an affidavit, whichever one the sellers want to do. So that's the reason that our forms have been delayed. They're very expensive to change. And when that title company attorney said that this declaration has been approved through certain channels and hasn't reached its final approval yet, that's when everybody backed off and said, well, we'll just hold off until we know that the declaration has been approved and can now be used.
Another question.
Uh-huh.
The change applies to 1 to 4 contact as well?
I'm sorry, I can hardly hear you, hon.
I'm sorry. This change, does it apply to the 1 to 4 contact as well, or only the unimproved?
Oh, no. You'll see it throughout every contract form, yes, that has the survey.
Thank you.
Only place you won't see it probably is in new home because it's either the seller will buy it or the buyer will buy it. But
Marilyn,
it is this proposed change. Uh-huh.
I have always questioned this and I've never done it out loud. Why do we even have a survey that we know will be copyrighted at this point with the T47? Why don't we just remove that?
Well, we asked, when we were on the Texas Realtors Task Force, we asked Trick to remove it.
And they won't do that?
No, and it's because of this attitude of this attorney that was on the broker lawyer committee, which I found very disrespectful, kind of laughing it off and saying, well, it won't bother us. Well, no, it doesn't affect the title company or the lender. You know who it affects? The listing agent.
Well, and then I have sellers. And I have
but the
buyers
sellers
say
are
they
going to
don't care.
blame, the sellers are going to blame the listing agent. Any listing
Right.
agent that advises their seller to use an existing survey, when it's very clear on the survey that it's used for one transaction only, period, that's subject. And it's interesting, they went into this huge discussion, which I felt was just, as I said, I almost piped up and said, just remove it like we asked you. Oh, they're not going to do that. So they're jumping through hoops, getting a declaration instead of an affidavit and all these other things. You don't violate copyright. You don't help others violate it. And are you going to be asking that attorney that popped off like that, hey, you pay my bills because you kind of laughed it off and thought it was okay, that no surveyor would do that? Well, they're
So
wrong.
what do we do when a buyer, when I'm representing a buyer and the seller has it listed as they have a survey with the T47 and my buyer says, I'll accept that?
Your
What-
buyer would only accept that if they knew that it's not for any purpose. They can't use it other than for lenders or title company using it. The buyers won't have one.
Okay,
If you don't have your name on it, is it yours?
no, right.
There you go. That's it. That's why relocation companies, REOs, they won't allow any existing surveys to be used. And they have an arsenal of attorneys. You think if it was okay, they would do it. But no, that's not the case. And again, as I said, I had a very different take when I heard that attorney acting like, and then the broker saying, oh, we've already got 3 demands going. Those demands are going to be paid. There is no insurance. Agents can't afford the legal bills that will be coming up from a copyright infringement. It's like $375 an hour at best. So they're just going to have to settle. But we don't ever encourage anyone to violate copyright, ever.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Everybody know how I feel about 6C1. If you've ever attended any of my training or listened to what I've done, I've never changed in the whole time. What's interesting is in paragraph 6C2, the word shall used to be there, right? So they thought may. And why? Because that would eliminate a buyer. If a buyer was paying cash and said, I don't require one, they would mark 6C2. And then if they didn't get a new survey, this paragraph wouldn't apply to them. Well, now they're changing all the language because what happens in 6C2 is if you've got a buyer who's financing and the buyer says, I don't want one, I don't have to get one, and the lender requires it to meet property approval. They had to add all this different legal language saying that the buyer would be in breach of the contract, and there's no provision for a termination if they don't get a survey when their lender might require it. So this paragraph is under heavy revisions right now. I'll keep you posted when they post the changes that they're recommending that go to the agents, everybody out there, to respond on it, the attorneys that represent brokerages and all these different things, title companies and stuff. You can go in and make your comment on it at that point in time. Any questions about the survey? Okay, now 6E, there were some changes. In several paragraphs, 4 and 7 and 10, they struck the part that says an addendum containing the notice will be attached. An addendum containing the required notice will be attached to the contract. An addendum containing all these languages were struck. You know why? It was interesting. One of the attorneys said, oh, this contract should not be about education. That's the agent's job. So while they remove it, it doesn't mean that you're not going to do what is required based upon the attached addenda for various provisions. But it was real interesting. They had this conversation about should we be educating the buyer and the seller with this contract form, or should they be educated by their agents before they ever agree to the provisions? And so they're removing this type of language like attaching this, attaching that as educational features that the buyer and agent and the listing agent would have to do. But they did change paragraph 12, the required notices. Most individuals didn't know that MUD stood for Municipal Utility District, WCID Water Control Improvement District, and Public Improvement District. So they actually put it if you have any notices that are required. And then they placed in there the provision that says seller's failure to provide applicable statutory notices may provide buyer with remedies or rights to terminate the contract. So that's what we're seeing as a proposed language. Sellers will know that they're in violation if they fail to provide the required notices prior to execution of the contract. It has to be signed by the buyer. Any questions?
Yes, Marilyn. So on this 12, because of the way it reads, it says the following notices have been given, but I've received several that were not given. So I'm adding in the statement in the blank line, no notices were provided. Can I still do that?
Your buyer can ask you to do that.
Okay, great.
Or
My
just
buyer,
a
my buyer
standing-
doesn't have a clue.
Well, your buyer is going to have a click because you're not going to insert anything without your buyer instructing you to do so.
Okay.
So you have the conversation with them, and then you get them to put it in writing for you.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Marilyn, I have a question. It's Carla. So what goes in the blank? What would you put in the blank?
I probably would put Municipal Utility District number 56, Harris County, utility district, whatever the name is of the district. That's what
Okay,
I
that makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah, just so it's clear. But what's interesting and what Karen had mentioned, see, this seller failure to provide, these are statutory required notices. If you look up at 6E3, if they're in these districts that were subject to Chapter 42 Texas Water Code, that's where they were created, they have to have them, and they're out there on the district's websites, right? And so those are the statutory requirements and they're very complicated. They're not like the HAR form. The law changed, and it requires all sorts of different breakouts about tax monies and what they were allocated for and various things. But you're going to see the same thing all throughout all the required notices and all the contract forms, the proposed change on something. They have to be executed by the buyer prior to the execution of the contract. Otherwise, the buyer has remedies. And believe it or not, we've had more buyers last year that exercised those remedies. And you know when they did it? At the closing table. And I mean, we're not talking about listing agents who don't know what they're doing. They just missed it. They omitted a very critical part to assist the seller with complying with the law. Okay. Now, the next change you're going to see is in the actual paragraph 20, right? And nobody ever reads it because it's no fill in the blanks. But this is about, they're taking out the word tax and they're putting federal requirements. And you're going to see where the farm and ranch contract was amended to add another type of federal requirement based upon something. But this is where the sellers are subject to FERPA. And again, if you're a listing agent and your sellers are subject to it, you have to provide written notice to the buyer prior to the contract being executed. And so that would be the best way probably would be to put it in agent remarks that the sellers are subject to FERPA on something like that. Okay, any questions about that? Pretty simple, right? Okay, so the next form we're going to get to is the form that we use for the majority of the time. And there are the same changes that we saw in paragraph 6, but a little bit more that we're going to talk about. So the very first change is the geothermal, the one, the natural resource lease. The next one is in 6. C, of course, the survey, the same ones we talked about. They talked about buyer may, but there are going to be lots of changes there. The next one is in 6E, and these are these statutory tax district notices too. And those little notices about what this should be attached to the contract if this addendum applies and that type of thing. But look what they did in paragraph 6E11. Certificate of mold remediation. If the property has been remediated for mold, seller must provide to buyer each certificate of mold damage remediation issued under Chapter 1958.154 Occupations Code during the 5 years preceding the sale of the property. Okay, this has had tons of discussion in my previous sessions. So here's what happens. When a seller has water damage not due to a flood, right? They have to mark that on the seller's disclosure. Now, if the seller didn't remediate it, that would be the first question a buyer would ask, wouldn't they? Yeah, because as a buyer's agent, you go through that seller's disclosure with the buyer. And any type of water damage, usually what happens with water damage, folks?
Mold.
That's the problem, folks. That is the problem. Now, if there was water damage, right, it's on the seller's disclosure, buyer sees it, and the buyer says, can you find out if they did any mold remediation? So as a good buyer's agent, you put in writing to the listing agent, did the sellers remediate for any mold with that water damage? If the sellers come back and say yes, then you're going to need what? The certificate. If the seller comes back and says, no, we did not do any remediation for mold, what do you think the buyer's going to want to do?
An inspection.
A mold
Looking for-
inspection.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you what is just unbelievable. We had a rash of these because of Harvey, okay, and Harvey was in 2017. The problem was all these distressed owners had various wonderful people come in, nonprofits that helped take everything away, right? Went up 6 feet, 7 feet, sometimes whatever it was. And some insurance companies, when the claims were done, they do send out remediators because they want to make sure that the property is what? Restored properly, right? They're insuring it. But sometimes the sellers didn't do that. They may not have had that additional coverage. And so it's all on their own in these type of things. But no buyer, when they're told the truth by a seller about water damage, and if the seller says, no, we didn't remediate for mold, there was no mold, would the buyer, as Carla said, the buyer would have to have it inspected for mold. because that's just common sense. And any buyer who wouldn't do that, they've really accepted the property knowing, right? That's the problem that we have. Now, in my case, the sellers lied and the listing agent helped cover it up. And I lost everything. So I know a whole lot about mold. Unfortunately, when it happens to you personally, you kind of figure out a whole lot more. So again, it's not that the sellers were required to, right? But a buyer would have to do their due diligence to do it. And one agent told me, she said, well, my seller's not going to allow that. Well, then that's not going to be the property for the buyer. You know, sometimes some properties based on it, and the seller not wanting to do it. And where it wasn't coming into play within the last 5 years was the freezes and all the pipes that burst and those other damages and stuff like that. A lot of agents have sold those properties. And then when the buyer went in and decided to do a little remodeling and that type of, then they found mold behind where things were restored and stuff like that. One broker told about the story that was absolutely horrendous, is that flippers went in, sold the property, and were told that there had been flooding, right? So the flipper disclosed it and said that the previous seller said it was fixed. And when these people went in, the flipper said it went up 6 feet. But when they went to 8 feet, it was obvious that the damage the previous seller had done went up much higher. They failed to put insulation in, all the wiring and everything was ruined in it was just disastrous. So again, don't be an alarmist, but bottom line is if there's been water damage in the property, a tub overflowed, you know, the sink was leaking, or I had an agent who called me and said that they were in their family room and she heard this cracking sound when it was real cold. Remember when we had the freezing cold temperatures? She heard this real cracking sound. She wasn't sure where it was. She went to the utility room, couldn't find it. Turned out the tank on the toilet cracked and it flooded underneath into the master bedroom closet and those types of things. So things happen like that. They're just incorporating what is required if there's been a certificate of mold remediation that the buyer needs to receive that. Any questions? And they think what we do is so easy, folks.
This is going to stir up a lot.
Oh, I know it is.
Yeah.
Oh, I had over 100 and something agents on one call. And I mean, we went on for a long time. And the broker was on the training as well and others. And they were all talking about what they've experienced on something like this. My thing is, it's a fact. Either the seller did it and has it, or they don't. And if the seller won't let the buyer do that type of inspection, the buyer is going to have to pass on the property because they've accepted it knowing all of this. And that's what will hurt them legally. Once you have knowledge of something, you have a duty to what? Further investigate, make sure that it is something that you accept. Now, we would have trouble if a seller would not disclose that they had some kind of water damage. That's not a good thing to do. Okay, the next change that we're going to see, of course, is in paragraph 20. The same thing, they remove the word tax and have federal requirements, okay, on something like this. And that's part of what we see throughout all of the contract forms. And you'll see the additional change in the farm and ranch contract. Now, before I leave here, I want to talk to you a little bit about what one of the attorneys said about 6D objections. See that 6D? And she said she, you know, is an attorney who's helped HAR and all over and stuff like that. She said that no buyer agent could ever assist their buyer with objections. What do y'all think about that?
Can you repeat?
Yeah, the attorney said that no buyer agent can assist the buyer with objections.
Like in telling them what that they can look or how to fill the spot
They
in?
have to have an attorney that would assist them with their objections.
I don't see mine.
It says buyer must object the earlier of one, the closing date, or two, whatever number of days after buyer receives the commitment, exception documents, and the survey. So if the buyer finds something on these surveys that they object to and want the seller to have the cure period date where they get 15 days to cure the objections, that attorney was saying we can't help the buyer with that, only an attorney could. Okay, now I'm going to give you our, and one of the brokers had a little bit to say about that because they know we practice real estate, right? Most of the encroachments on surveys about fencing, we've had some situations where the buyer was advised to get their attorney to, write the objection and send it over to title. I've seen 3 this last week, and they showed me all the objections that were written by the various attorneys for the buyers. But many times it's an encroachment issue about the fencing is either their fence for that subject property they're buying has encroached on someone else's property, or the other party has encroached on theirs, right? Those kinds of things. I'm just going to tell you that's when they make those kinds of comments, I usually like to pass them along. Once a buyer says, I don't need an attorney to tell you to tell them, I'll write it up saying I want that fence moved within the boundary lines. I don't want the neighbor encroaching on my property. Okay, whatever it is. Buyers can do that. The problem is you can't do something without the buyer having put it in writing to you. Okay, while you advise them to get an attorney, if they feel they can handle the objection plainly, so the title company will know it and the other parties will be willing to agree to it and start the cure period. What was kind of interesting, what started all that discussion was an agent in the state said, it says to use the form, can you provide us a form to use? And that's what embroiled that discussion by the attorney. Said, well, you can't do that. We don't have a form. We're not going to create a form because you have to have an attorney do that form. So anyway, I've seen it on amendments. I don't know about you, but an amendment is to modify or change any provision in the contract or add to it, right? Yeah, I've seen that where the parties agree to, in lieu of something, discussion about it, whatever comes up. But again, I just wanted you to be aware of where the lawyers were coming from on the broker lawyer committee. Okay, again, the paragraph 20 was the federal tax. Now the next form, there's going to be quite a few more contract forms. So what we've got is we have the new home contract for incomplete construction and complete construction, the exact same changes, the geothermal in number 4. Now in paragraph 6C, oh, I love this provision. At either the seller's going to buy it for the buyer or the buyer's going to buy it. Simple. We don't have to worry about all that other stuff that's in 6C1 in our contracts and stuff like that for a 1 to 4 family and unimproved. Again, in paragraph 6, they have the various strike-throughs about the addendas attached. They have the certificate of mold remediation, and then they have the new provisions identifying more about the statutorily required notices that have to be given. Can somebody tell me about certificate of mold remediation for new construction? Do y'all think that's strange having that in there?
Why would you? Yeah.
Okay, I just want to let you know, in personal experience, we've had an issue. There's what roofs do?
A leak.
Well, when a builder doesn't have a roof on the new construction yet, what happens with all the water?
Oh, the wood's getting wet.
There you go. And so we've had it, they don't put the roof up first. There's something that has to be built to support a roof, right? And we had a situation where before the roof was on, there was an extreme wet condition and rain, which caused on the 2x4s and those types of things. And the builder had to go in there and remediate those types of things. So It's kind of interesting on something like that. So I just thought I'd let you know how that works. Again, the next change is in paragraph 20, that word tax has been removed from federal requirements. Same changes on the new home contract completed construction, right? Same changes we just went through. And we're going to get to the, I think the next one should be, sorry about that. It takes a little while to get through all of that. Is the farm and ranch contract, because these are a little bit different than some of the other changes. Okay, on the farm and ranch, remember how on unimproved property contract, they modified 3D, they added D. Well, if you look at 3D in the farm and ranch, it has been there. What they did lack was a $sign in front of the blank per acre. Can you ever put TBD when there's a $sign required?
Probably not.
Never. The promulgated forms are pretty clear. If they show a $sign, you better put a dollar value. Could be zero, but you have to have a value. If they put a percentage, you can't say market. You can't say TBD. It has to be an actual number. Okay, so just remember, they're pretty particular about you making sure that you're complying with the terms of the promulgated form as a buyer and seller. The geothermal was added in paragraph 4, the natural resource leases. And in paragraph 6, those same changes in 6C and survey will be done. But more importantly, there's a lot of issues regarding objections and exception documents and surface leases. Farm and ranch is a highly specialized practice of real estate, much like commercial is in property management and those types of things. And so they did add the certificate of mold remediation, which could affect the improvement on the property. And then they renumbered the required notices to be 12. So they have those same changes that we've seen in the other contract forms. Now, what's interesting about this one is in the paragraph 20 that we talked about, they added a new paragraph. And the first one, they lettered it A and said if a seller is a foreign person and they're subject to those regulations. But B is the Agricultural Foreign Investment Disclosure Act. Requires that a foreign person who acquires, disposes of, or holds an interest in United States agricultural land must disclose such transactions and holding to the Secretary of Agriculture. Foreign persons must file an FSA-153 in the Farm Service Agency, FSA Service Center, where the land is physically located, within 90 days of the date of the transaction. Failure to report is subject to civil penalty up to 25% of the fair market value of the land on the date. The penalty is assessed. Consult an attorney or tax professional. That's exactly what you're going to tell them. You're not going to explain this paragraph at all from a legal standpoint of what they're required. And one of them says, so the seller must do it or the buyer. It says that a foreign person who acquires would be what? The buyer. Disposes of, a seller. Yeah, there are obligations federally on these types of buyers and sellers. So, as I said, very complicated type of thing. Fortunately, we're not involved in it. They have to do all of that. It's not a form that we have on something like that. And consult an attorney or tax professional. We should probably be in bold on something like that. Okay. So now we've gone through the majority. There's the residential condominium contract, same changes. Yay, we don't have surveys for condominiums, so we don't have that issue. But there are the issues regarding any type of, oh, Maryland, the geothermal is not on the natural resource. Yeah, because you don't own the land under your condo. Yeah, condominiums are unique. You really need to know about them if you're going to assist a buyer or seller. But in paragraph 60, it's 60 everywhere else, but 60, they had those same strike-throughs about those various addenda attached. Then they added the certificate of mold remediation, and they modified the required notices paragraph. So they did a little bit on the condominium contract as well, on something like that. And then they, of course, took out the word tax in paragraph 20. So those are the contract forms that are under revision. Now we're going to look at third party. Now, what's interesting is nothing negative about their changes was brought up on this, so nobody's gotten this under advisement for any additional changes on it. And here's what I love. In paragraph 2A, they made the change. I wish personally this would be approved right away and let it go, and then the contracts will wait till later. But instead of a buyer just giving written notice and the notice of buyer's termination of contract to a seller that they did not get buyer approval, right? If they want to use this provision, they actually have to give the seller not only the notice of termination and a copy of a written statement from the lender setting forth the reasons for lender's determination. If buyer terminates the contract under this provision, they're going to get their provision of receiving the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. So what is great about this is it takes that gap that we've had so many times where a seller gets a notice and the buyer said, oh, I didn't get approval or I didn't get these terms, but the lender's not backing them up, right? The buyer is just doing this and using this provision, and they can. It doesn't say, current forms do not say that they have to have the lender's determination in writing. This one will. It'll be the same as property approval. A buyer cannot terminate based upon this unless the lender has their formal written notice on something like that. What they did modify was to make it clear about counting days in 2B. Because right now it says that it had to be 3 days prior to the closing date, right? Now it says that on or before the third day before the closing date. It wasn't real clear. A lot of agents said, does that count, that third day count, the first day of the third day count as one? Can we do it then, or do we have to do it the prior day? So they've made it very clear. It's on or before the third day before the closing date. So everything has to be tied up in a little sweet bow, and the buyers can give the written notice, but they also have to obviously have the lenders a formal declination in writing by the property did not meet approval on something like that. Now, the only other change in 4 is they changed the word requirements to requirement, and then instead of having 2.b. they put paragraph 2B, which is right here, which no VA and FHA purchaser is subject to that notice. Any questions? I like that change. I really do. Think it's really good. Okay, the next one, if you haven't gathered from all these revisions that went into play in 22 and were approved in 23, they don't want you writing anything in the contract. And what was customarily done is the 1031 exchange intermediary would provide language to the party that was exercising that section 1031, the IRS code, and then we would insert that in special provisions, so that the buyer and seller all knew and that IRS could see that this was to accomplish this exchange, right? So now they've created an addendum just for that. And it says buyer seller intends to use this property to accomplish an exchange of like-kind properties under section 1031 of the IRS code as amended. And B, the parties will reasonably cooperate to accomplish this, the exchange provided. 1, the non-exchanging party will not incur any additional expense or liability. And 2, closing will not be delayed as a result of the exchange. Okay, so they're creating a special addendum. Now, what I am going to tell you is there was a lot of discussion and feedback from agents all over Texas about the notice to purchasers, right? So the law changed the legislators were not thinking the impact it would have on these associations and these districts and stuff like that, that manage all of these statutorily required notices and stuff. So as of 9/1, they had to have it up on their website, right? We can't use the HAR one, and HAR brought it back for a couple of weeks because these districts were not prepared. We even had visits with some of the attorneys that helped these districts, and they were kind of behind the 8 ball as far as getting it done. So what do you think TREC is doing? TREC is saying, oh, we need to create a form because there are some districts that are not complying with the law. And the feedback from a lot of people in Houston, including a broker that is with the Keller Williams operation, this form is not easy to complete, period. And what most of the negativity about TREC doing this is that it's going to put the onus on the listing agent, right? Sellers are going to say, well, I don't know how to complete it. We don't complete anybody's disclosures, folks, period. My thought is don't use the form ever. Just get it from the district. And if the district doesn't provide the notice, then the seller is going to have to ask all the questions that is going to be necessary to complete the notice. Most of the districts, once they were fast tracking getting it back up on the website, we found them in the districts, okay? And again, those are districts that are subject to those statutory requirements under the Texas Water Code, Chapter 49. So, but they're working on it. They had lots of discussions about it. There were so many people who wrote in about it on something like that. My concern is you create that form and a seller is going to look to the listing agent, and that puts that listing agent in a hard spot, right? We don't fill out their seller's disclosure. What makes them think we're going to fill out their statutorily required notice to purchasers in those districts? So again, while they may revise it later or decide to scrap it, they haven't determined all of that when we had the broker lawyer committee this month. My thing is, no seller would use any form other than what the district provides. That keeps you agents out of trouble. Totally. And again, as I said, it's typical of legislators doing something and they're not thinking the impact. It was devastating. We had more attorneys who said, well, you have to give us X number of days, all this kind of stuff. They were arguing, and TREC said, oh no, the law says you have to have it done. It was in June when they passed it, and it went into effect immediately. So it was a very chaotic type of thing, truthfully. And you know that by HAR withdrawing it, right? You couldn't use it. And then the next thing you know, they brought it back because those districts were not ready at that time. The problem is the HAR form did not comply with the statutory requirements of law. And anyway, presented a big, huge problem. So in a nutshell, you're going to be prepared for these. Are these finalized? No, as I said, they're still talking about all the various changes regarding that declaration instead of an affidavit for existing surveys. But at least you're aware of some of the things that are coming up. And I'll let you know when you need to comment on it so that you can actually get your word heard. They read everything. They comment on it. They use a spreadsheet to show what the agent is asking for them to reference, or the attorney that represents an association or a brokerage. They make all their comments and they read all of those and they take them seriously on something like that before they approve it. So any questions? Okay, what we're going to do next time, I am going to be heading to the Texas Realtors winter meetings. There are a couple of things that are on the schedule. Supposedly Texas Realtors, because they were sued in this class action litigation that's hit Texas now, they're supposed to give us an update on that, and then some other items on the risk reduction committee meeting that we'll be doing. And then I'll be attending the professional standards and grievance training for our code of ethics. In April is our fair housing. And Dilsey, we always talk about that. We do our fair housing in the month of April. That's when they celebrate it. But we're going to talk about the code of ethics as well next time so that everybody can kind of be updated on what's going on. They usually, because we have so many wonderful brokers in the state of Texas that actually sit on various committees at NAR, they're privy to a lot of the underpinnings of what is going on, sometimes by region, sometimes it's by topic and that type of thing. So I'll be updating you on what I find out when I attend on my 6-hour meeting that I have scheduled at that time. All right, good people. Please take care, stay safe and well, and I look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Thank you.
You're welcome.